So good morning, Victor.
Morning.
You doing okay?
Yes. How are
You all
you?
recovered?
Yes, recovered.
Very good.
Hi, how are you, Victor?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm doing fine.
Is it hot in Seoul?
It's raining,
It's a very hot and very much rainy.
so I'm all wet,
Oh,
as you can
well,
see.
Yeah, it's probably the worst part of the year, the worst
yeah,
season.
yeah.
But that cools off the weather. That's a good
Yeah.
part.
Then you get beautiful September. So
No, yes.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to second day of NEREC conference, NEREC-Sejong International Conference on Nuclear Nonproliferation. Today, we're starting the day with a special session with two very renowned experts on North Korea matters. So we have invited Professor Victor Cha and Professor Bong Jun, one of the really notable experts on the issues of North Korea, Korean Peninsula, two of the most notable experts. And this is meant to be sort of a free talking session with a recap of what has been going on in the past and also how do we see the future and try to really get some wisdom from the past experiences they have experienced in the past. So let me briefly introduce the panelists this morning, and then we be getting on the business. So first of Victor Cha, basically he participated in the six-party talk as part of the deputy head of the delegation. But here today he's a vice dean and D.S. Song Korea Foundation Professor of Government in the School of Foreign Services and Department of Government at Georgetown University. He's also Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C., what we know as CSIS. He was appointed by the Biden administration in 2021 to serve on the Defense Policy Board in an advisory role to the Secretary of Defense. He formerly served on the National Security Council from 2004 to 2007, where he was responsible for Japan, Korean Peninsula, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Island national affairs. Dr. Cha was also deputy head of the delegation, as we mentioned, of the United States at the six-party talks in Beijing and received two outstanding service recommendations during his tenure at National Security Council. He also was nominated to be the ambassador to South Korea by the Trump administration. For whatever reason, he was not appointed in the end, but that represents his reputation and his expertise on the matters of Korean Peninsula. He is the author of 5 books, including award-winning Alignment Despite Antagonism, the book published by Stanford University Press. Dr. Cha received his PhD in political science from Columbia University, master's from Columbia, and then bachelor's degree from Oxford and Columbia in economics and philosophy and politics. And also Professor Bong Jun, another very renowned expert on Korean Peninsula issues. He was also introduced yesterday. He served as policy advisor to the Ministry of Unification and secretary for the International Security Affairs at the President's Office in South Korea. And also he served as a professional staff for the Kido project, and he visited North Korea and dealt with basically North Korean officials while the project was going well. Dr. Jun is serving as the professor and then Director General of International Security Matters at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. So with these two renowned experts with us, I'd like to ask first Professor Cha, basically give us a little bit of recap of what you have experienced in dealings with North Korea as part of the six-party talks and all the follow-on of development. And also your current prognosis of the situation and what do you see is the future with this North Korean challenge. So, Professor Cha.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind invitation. I'm happy to be at the NEREC conference. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I've been dealing with COVID over the summer, and it makes it hard to travel to Korea because things are much stricter in Korea than they are in the United States. So, but I'm happy to be on this panel and happy to share the stage with my good friend Bongun, who is one of the most experienced people, I would say, in the world on dealing with North Korea and the issue of denuclearization negotiations. So I'm very happy to be on the panel with him. In your introduction, you noted that one of my potential service assignments for the U.S. government was an appointment in the Trump administration. The reason that never came through was that frankly, I was opposed to the bloody nose strike, the idea of a bloody nose strike, and that's why I didn't end up going to Seoul. I should also say that the views here represent my personal opinion. They don't represent the views of the U.S. government or the Department of Defense. The North Korean situation is one that has gone through fits and starts, really dating back for the United States back to the Reagan administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, starting with what was then called the Modest Initiative under Undersecretary Arnold Cantor. And it has evolved in the form of really two major agreements that were reached in 1994 and 2005. There were subsequent efforts, but those were sort of the two major agreements. As everyone in this room knows very well, the first agreement in 1994, done by the Clinton administration with North Korea, the agreed framework, was successful at temporarily freezing the plutonium production program at Yongbyon, and probably most importantly, stopping progress on the two new sites that they were building at the time, the 50 megawatt and the 200 megawatt reactor. In 2005 to 2007, the six-party talks again sought to freeze plutonium production at Yongbyon, but also focused on trying to go further than a temporary freeze by seeking some disablement of North Korean capabilities, as well as the provision of some of the operating records at Yongbyon. An effort in the end that was unsuccessful at getting North Korea to provide a declaration of their second uranium-based nuclear program, but nonetheless an effort that concluded with the destruction of the iconic cooling tower at Yongbyon, but then really made no progress. No progress after that. The third very short-lived agreement was during the Obama administration, the so-called Leap Day deal, which was a quid pro quo of a freeze on North Korean bomb-making capabilities in return for some humanitarian assistance. But that barely lasted a month before North Korea's launch of a civilian space launch vehicle was deemed a violation of the agreement by the Obama administration, after which the administration followed a strategy of strategic patience, focused on maximum sanctions and no negotiations. And then, of course, the most recent period was the Trump administration, where we saw high-level leader-to-leader diplomacy, this time with Kim Jong-un, high-level leader-to-leader diplomacy, which was something that it was significant in the sense that that had not yet been tested in the history of US DPRK negotiations, a leader-to-leader level meeting. Letters had been sent by the US president to the North Korean leader. Clinton sent the letter, President Bush sent the letter. So letters had been sent, communications had been sent leader to leader, but a face-to-face meeting was something that had never happened before. And so that was an interesting effort that tested the hypothesis that that in order to get real progress in denuclearization, you had to speak to the one person in North Korea that was the only one who made a decision about this, and that was Kim Jong-un. But as we all know, 3 meetings between President Trump and the North Korean leader, as well as numerous letters and communications between the two of them, did not result in any movement in terms of denuclearization. That takes us to the Biden administration, where I think we're currently in a situation where North Korea's nuclear and missile programs really look like they're unstoppable right now. They're developing a range of capabilities, now in particular on the missile side, using, both long range and short range, mobile delivery systems, solid propellant, aiming for multiple warheads, maneuverable reentry vehicles, really trying to develop the full array of capabilities that would confound U.S. national missile defense systems. Of course, the United States is expanding and modernizing their missile and augmenting and supplementing their missile defense system. But I would argue that North Korea's progress on their programs is moving faster than our modernization of our missile defense systems, which puts an even higher priority on robust theater missile defense, not just national missile defense in the United States, but theater missile defense capabilities with countries like Korea, with allies like Korea and Japan. So the Biden administration has said that they are willing to meet with North Korea any place, anytime, anywhere. So unconditional, which is different from the past. But the North Koreans have not been responsive to these efforts. My understanding is that the Biden administration has reached out in one form or another to North Korea for discussions almost 20 times in the last year, and there has been really, literally, no response from North Korea. So that unfortunately, that is the situation as it stands today. It's not a good one for certain. I have thoughts on why the North is not willing to engage in negotiations right now. But let me leave that as my initial sort of survey of the history of these negotiations and turn it back to you and Seoul. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cha, for the vivid recap of what you have seen over the years, and look forward to hearing more from you through this discussion. And also like to invite Professor John, also based on your experiences, in particular your Kido project experiences, love to hear some of your lessons learned.
Following this very short but excellent recap of what had happened during the last 20, 30 years, I just want to say a couple of words about what went wrong. Both in terms of during our 30 years long denuclearization diplomacy and what went wrong with the Kido project. Easy answer to this question was that it's a DPRK's fault. They didn't, cooperate with us. But it's a DPRK is a bad country, bad people. I don't want to, it's somewhat useless to blame them, additionally. So just I want to say what went wrong, from our side. How have we mishandled the situations? That's what I'm going to say briefly. First, our 30 years of denuclearization diplomacy, I just want to say that we failed first we underestimated the DPRK's durability and their capability and the desire for nuclear armament. Throughout the 90s, when the situation was extremely favorable to us, we are rising country, becoming middle power, and we are part of this, UK hegemonic system. But DPRK was, in extremely difficult situations. But during the time, we failed to engage with the DPRK fully and make some changes. That's one of the. So in the 90s, we just waited until DPRK, collapsed, but it didn't. It didn't. We didn't take advantage of those favorable years for the denuclearization and for better relations with the DPRK. In that, the part of the reason was that we didn't have a good North Korean policy. We just the best policy in the 90s was just waiting. But we underestimated the DPRK's durability, regime durability, and the systemic durability. And also, secondly, our North Korea policy was not consistent. As you know, that when we have changed our government from left to right, our North Korea policy was one of the first having that kind of changes. So even if I'm DPRK, I'm not going to listen to the current incumbent government because later their policy is going to change. So this kind of our such a big fluctuation of North Korea policy was failing in making any impact on the DPRK. In fact, we have emphasized the coordination between U.S. and South Korea, but that didn't work out very well. And also, our strategy was not good enough. Whenever there is a Libyan denuclearization success case, or Kazakhstan's case, Ukraine's case, or even the Iran's case, we hastily adopted that kind of strategy. But each of these denuclearization success story has their own background, their own political and economic context. For example, when there was a Iranian denuclearization success story by having JCPOA in 2015, a lot of Koreans and probably Americans too just said that strong pressure on the Iran is working. So a lot of those days, the best strategy was to have more pressure. But for me, it was Iranian government's their economic political system that was different from DPRK. There is a middle class who could complain to the government in Iran so that they could change government. But in case of DPRK, it's different. So that kind of, also Libya, when Libya decided to give up the weapons, and also that the Libyan model was again adopted by early Trump government. But they showed us a lesson that if we only add more pressure, Libya is going, North Korea is going to give up the weapons just like Libya did. But in my analysis, Libya did not have such a strong security incentive to go nuclear, and their nuclear development is such an early stage. So probably they tried to get the weapons at that time, those days, just to get a little bit of a prestige. So it's the pressure against the DPRK was working much better than against the DPRK. And also, as you know, the DPRK, Libya is exporting oil, so the sanction is working much better in those cases. And also, in order to solve a nuclear problem, just like any other cases, we need to somehow address DPRK's strong motives for going nuclear. But what we did against DPRK was only strengthening DPRK's incentives to go nuclear. of course, it's going to be very hard to find any solutions to easing DPRK's anxieties. But however, whatever we do, it's going to giving more incentive for the DPRK to cling to their nuclear weapons programs. So those are some of the the kind of points that I want to make out why we failed. How to address them? It's going to be very difficult, but I can't really go any detail on that part.
Yeah.
Just I want to say a few words about the KIDO project. As I mentioned earlier, some classes that KIDO project was a somewhat ad hoc project. It was not well-planned project. So from having US DPRK agreed framework of 1994 and the launching real construction project 2000, it has had, we have around 6 years of time span. So DPRK was thinking that South Korea and the US is not going to give us nuclear power plant. Just J1, what they want was to buy time. We give them such an impression. And also, DPRK was never ready to receive a nuclear power plants. Their power grid is too poor. We cannot really put our nuclear power plant in DPRK power grids. If we do it, it's going to destroy DPRK's electrical power transmission systems. And also, DPRK has such a poor national credit. So DPRK cannot buy nuclear accident liability insurance from anybody. So without having such an insurance, no one in South Korea and the US suppliers are ready to give their components to the DPRK. All those problems were there. I better stop
Thank you.
there.
So, panelists, you are aware that we have a good group of students in this conference, and then they are potentially future leaders of global nuclear non-proliferation or maybe even dealings with North Korea. We have students from basically all over the world. Like to ask you if you can share your wisdom based on your experiences, maybe some failures, maybe missed opportunities along the way. And if we do it again, or if this young generation people have an opportunity to deal with this challenge again, what would you recommend if you go back and sort of replay the thing? And then what is your word of wisdom for the young generation people? How should they prepare to tackle this challenge in the upcoming years? Any thoughts you could come up with? That'll be very useful and appreciated for the students. Victor, maybe first.
Okay. In terms of things that could be done over again, I think I do agree with Bongun that the opportunity to try to negotiate a way, or at least to minimize North Korea's nuclear program was in the 1990s. I guess I would agree with the narrative that I've seen out there that in the 1990s there was at least a chance to convince North Korea that its nuclear weapons program would make them less secure rather than more secure, and that giving up those programs would provide a lot of benefits to North Korea. I think I'm not saying it's a convincing argument, but it's a credible argument about the 1990s relative to the time periods that followed. Because I think as we move further along, the North Koreans basically had decided that they were going to pursue a weapons program. And the negotiations served a purpose for them, but in the end, I think that they had decided that. The only thing that makes me more skeptical of the argument about the 1990s is that when we look back at the satellite imagery, the declassified CIA satellite imagery of the Yongbyon site, North Korea, after they had received the experimental reactor from the Soviet Union, was already, they weren't constructing, but they were already clearing out the land in Yongbyon for a much bigger complex, aside from the 2000, whatever it was, the IRT, the experimental IRT reactor. So I think Kim Il-sung, even back then, had some notion of a much larger program. But having said that, I think relatively speaking, compared to the 2000s and what followed after that, if there was a time when it was possible to stem the nuclear program in North Korea, it was probably in the early 1990s, either by negotiation or by military action, right? Because as we know, the Clinton administration also considered military action against North Korea at that time. Now the idea of military action on a program that is so large and with a credible North Korean ability to retaliate just seems to, doesn't seem to make any sense. That it was one of the reasons why I thought the whole idea of the bloody no strike didn't make any sense to me. Didn't make any sense to me at all. For the students out there, there are a couple of things. I mean, I think in this field, first is to really understand the history of the nuclear negotiations, of the negotiations over North Korea's nuclear program. It's easy to get pulled into stereotypes or caricatures of these negotiations, but really to study them very carefully and seriously. And don't just read one account. Don't just read one account of what happened in 1994 or in 2005, 2007, or in 2018, right? Try to read as many accounts as possible to really get a balanced and full picture of the capability. One of the things, as someone who's worked on this and has given talks around the world about this, the question I always get, representing the American view is, why didn't the United States just sit down with North Korea? Or why didn't the United States just provide more incentives to North Korea? And, that is based on a journalistic reading of what happened. If you talk to or read some of the accounts by participants, a lot of effort went into negotiations. A lot of effort went into thinking up incentives for the negotiations, much more than I think is popularly understood. So that would be the first point, is to really understand the history of these negotiations, both efforts by the United States, since the United States is the primary interlocutor for the West. but also the South Korean efforts, right? Whether it was through Kido or through the six-party talks or through Kim Dae-jung's efforts or Moon Jae-in's efforts, really read and understand as much about these accounts as you can. I always found that when we went to negotiations, the two delegations that were by far the most prepared were the South Koreans and the Japanese, right? Those two delegations were the most prepared in terms of understanding the history of the negotiations, understanding the meaning of certain words in joint statements in the context of the history of the negotiations, understanding all the nuances. I felt like the Japanese and the Korean delegations were well prepared. I understood all these things because I had been a scholar and had written about it. But I would even argue that some of my American team members didn't understand it as well, or they had read one account as opposed to many accounts, and so I think that's important. The other thing that I want to say that's important, that's slightly off topic but related because it is about nuclear for this younger generation, is I think going forward into the future as the North Korean nuclear problem looks more and more intractable, and we are forced to deal with and live with a nuclear North Korea, this will naturally raise questions about the credibility of the U.S. security commitment and the credibility of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence. I think it's very important for that younger generation, those students in the room, to really understand, to really start to understand nuclear deterrence. It's important. It's important because it also connects these experts with alliance managers, who really will need to look to experts like the people in this room to tell them, when the United States says that they have a nuclear umbrella over South Korea, what does that really mean? I mean, as an expert, do you believe that the credibility of the U.S. nuclear commitment is more than just words? That takes training. Even in the United States now, we're the Cold War generation of national security experts were trained in sort of nuclear deterrence and early warning systems and crisis instability and all these delegation of authority, first strike versus second strike. I mean, we were trained in all of these things, but with the end of the Cold War and with the end of the U.S.-Soviet conflict, people aren't as trained in these things anymore. And so my point is that this, I think, is more and more important for younger rising South Korean nuclear experts and alliance experts to understand. We at CSIS are actually thinking about this and thinking about putting together a program for younger rising nuclear experts in South Korea and future alliance managers in South Korea, so that they can be trained on these sorts of things. I see that Toby Dalton's going to join you later, and Toby's a lot younger than me, but he's like one of the few folks out there that really understand, that from a non-Cold War generation, that really understands all of these things, and I think it's very important for younger South Koreans to understand them as well.
Thank you so much, Victor. Let's go to Bong.
Even in order to handle these North Korean nuclear issues, there is not just one or two or even three, more than three, fields of expertise, knowledge that you have to grasp. You have to know North Korea, you have to know U.S., you have to know South Korea, and also in South Korea there is left South and the right South. You have to know politics of South Korea, and also you have to know vocabulary of nuclear things. Without knowing the vocabulary, you cannot have any argument with people in the room. And also, as Victor mentioned, even among nuclear things, you have to have some technical side and also security side. He was mentioning mostly about the security side. All those how nuclear doctrines, strategies are working or not. Those are the kind of issues that we have to put together in order to have the problem to be solved. All these players are becoming a kind of a veto players. We cannot ignore any one of them. Whatever good plan do we have, if China says no, if DPRK says no, or South Korea is left or right, or even U.S., we have to have some good knowledge of all those related things. Otherwise, we cannot come up with a good solutions. Just like as I said, that we had thought, Iran model was good, Libya model was good, but there is some, as Victor mentioned, journalists are picking up some knowledge from Iranian case and the Libyan case. But when I look at in detail, how that problem was solved was completely different from as we know from these newspapers. So I think you need to have some deep knowledge of certain related areas. And as a scholar, you may, if you pick up a good knowledge in one area, you can easily pick knowledge from the other side. For personally, I didn't have any knowledge of nuclear until I began working at the Blue House. But one of the work that I was doing, in 1993, there was a North Korean nuclear crisis just began. And then I have to know something. All of us was new to these programs, North Korea. So I have to go down our KAIRI, the Nuclear Energy Institute, and I have to talk to people at KNE, who is a Nuclear Control Institute. Then you could accumulate the knowledge, and also you could, becoming, after years, you could become an expert. So I just want to recommend that if you, as a scholar, if you have a knowledge, just not or one or two, if you had about 3 or 4 knowledge groups, you could become more competitive. I would say it's a kind of portfolio. You have, U.S., North Korea, South Korea, or nuclear things, nuclear energy or nuclear security strategy. Then you can, you could be, you could, work anywhere, and probably you could be more competitive in this, any field. Yeah, I will stop.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we didn't assign enough time to this special session. But before we go away, I'd like to really get more wisdom from these two experts. As you know, we have a follow-on session on North Korea, meeting the dual challenge, denuclearization and deterrence against nuclear-armed North Korea. So maybe as sort of a prelude, or maybe as sort of your sage to the next session, what would you say is the ultimate goal of this dialogue? And what would you recommend to the panelists in the next session in terms of how we should navigate in this troubled world or roads, and then prepare for the ultimate outcome, whatever that may be? And what would be your hope for that ultimate outcome?
Well, that's a really hard question. That's a really hard question to answer. Let me say a couple of things. The first, to build on the last points that Bong-gun made about developing, these different areas of expertise. The other thing that I would note for the students, and this is a warning, is that studying North Korea is like a Rorschach test, in the sense that you can see what you want when it comes to North Korea. If you want to see North Korea as threatening, you can find plenty of evidence to show that North Korea is threatening. If you want to say that North Korea is insecure, and that's what drives its behavior, there's plenty of evidence you can find to show that North Korea is insecure. So it's kind of a Rorschach test, because we tend to place our own assumptions onto the intentions of North Korea. The answer to that, I would argue, is to try to develop an ability to make data-based arguments about North Korea, right? Data-informed arguments about North Korea. At CSIS, we've been developing databases of North Korean provocations, North Korean meetings with China, North Korean negotiations, and we've tried to let the data speak for themselves. Because in Washington, D.C., there's lots of people who can make any argument they want on North Korea. And so what we try to do is say, this is what the data says. And sometimes the data doesn't agree with my own views, what I think about North Korea, but we'll still publish that data. So that's what I would say in terms of lessons for students. For the road ahead, I'm not going to lie, I think it's a very difficult one going forward. I think North Korea is on the threshold of achieving at least a rudimentary capacity to do the things that they want to do, which is to have a credible, survivable capability, second strike capability that would basically make keep North Korea secure, but also try to deter the United States. The big question after that is, will North Korea use this capability or talk about it the way Putin has talked about it in Ukraine? Not just a second strike capability, a retaliatory capability, but actually a first strike or denial capability. I think that's one of the things that everybody is worried about. In terms of solutions going forward, I'm going to let Sue Terry and Toby Dalton offer us advice on what the solutions are. I would say that I don't think military action is a solution. I think that sanctions are important, but I think Bonggun would agree with me that sanctions aren't a solution either. In fact, if we look at the lockdown North Korea has been under for COVID for the past 2.5 years, it undercuts any argument that says sanctions will cause North Korea to cave or to collapse, right? Because they have put the tightest sanctions possible on themselves, tighter than anything China could have done or Russia or anybody else. And then the third thing I would say is that that makes diplomacy necessary, right? We need to have diplomacy. It's really the only way forward to try to slow down the program, at least, because without that, it is as it is today, which is a runaway, unstoppable program. So let me turn it back to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I just want to say that very briefly, there are 4 pillars of our North Korea policy. You know, regardless of whether one is right or left, progressive or conservative, I think they are going to focus on these 4 issues. I think they're going to pursue them in parallel. First one is inter-Korean dialogue and cooperation. You know, even extreme right government is going to do that if there is a chance. That's one. Secondly, denuclearization negotiations. That's mostly between U.S. and DPRK. Whenever there is chances, they're going to pursue it. Third, international sanctions. It's going to be there, until DPRK completely remove their nuclear weapons. So it's going to be there for a long, long time. So even if it's right or left, they're going to support these sanctions. That's probably our ultimate goal without resorting to bloody nose. And fourthly, our deterrence against the DPRK. Previously, without the nuclear weapon, DPRK nuclear weapons, we have to have a strong deterrence capabilities. We always thought that DPRK is a very dangerous, aggressive regime. So we need the alliance, even in 90s, and even when the world is much peaceful than today. Today, the world is more dangerous, and the DPRK is supposed to have nuclear weapons and even the second strike capability. Soon they're going to have that. So the stronger our deterrence capability could be one of a big issue that we have to focus on from now on. So I believe that all these 4 issues will be on the table on the Korean government and the U.S. government and between two governments. But from time to time, the focus will be slightly changed. But even if you are having a very focus on one issue, I think we should not lose sight of other 3 issues. I think these 4 issues will be here for a long time in parallel. So that's how, if you look at the Korean issues, if you have these 4 pillars in your perspective, you could get a much better big picture of what's going on here.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to adjourn the session, although we love to spend a lot more time on these issues with you. But I truly, truly appreciate the presence of these 2 panelists and your contribution and sharing your wisdom. And I do hope that the students, including myself, have an opportunity to meet you, especially Victor, in person someday, somewhere. And I wish you a full recovery and then hope to see you soon. Okay, let's thank our panelists for this moment. And this will be followed immediately at the next session, chaired by Professor Gina Kim. So don't go away.
Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power Company is a world-class energy company that plays a pivotal role in providing stable energy through large nuclear and hydropower plants. It is taking lead in providing green energy through nuclear power as well as new and renewable energy sources. Upon its establishment in 2001, KHNP began to actively develop its nuclear power technology and has grown to be the largest power generation company in South Korea, with 5 nuclear power sites in addition to hydro and pumped storage power plants. With its management goal of becoming a global energy leader that empowers the world, KHNP focuses on generating safe and clean electricity. High credit ratings from major credit rating agencies, including Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, prove its sound financial structure and high profitability. Over the past 40 years, the global nuclear industry has gone through a number of crises. KHNP, however, continued construction and operation of nuclear power plants with the highest priority placed on safety and kept on developing technologies and accumulating experience. Such ceaseless efforts have produced an optimized system with nuclear construction to operation. Based on such efforts, KHNP consistently receives high scores in the WANO performance indicator and achieved the lowest unplanned capability loss factor among the world's nuclear powerhouses, with high equipment reliability and operational excellence of its nuclear power plants. Since Kori Unit 1, KHNP has strived to achieve nuclear technology independence. Through persistent efforts, it successfully developed APR 1400, the third-generation reactor, and exported it to the United Arab Emirates, thereby demonstrating its technological excellence to the world. The advanced nuclear power plant, led by KHNP, includes a number of innovations. The passive auxiliary feed water system keeps the reactor cooled in case of power loss. The core catcher technology contains the molten fuel inside in emergency cases. For major safety systems, the 4-train concept is applied so that one operable train is enough to safely cool down the reactor in an emergency. Aside from the 4 emergency diesel generators, an independent source of emergency power, safety class batteries will be able to keep the plant online for at least 72 hours during a loss of power event. The design includes many reinforced safety measures intended to deal with natural disasters for operating power plants. Based on these technological enhancement and greater safety, KHNP acquired design certification from the US NRC as well as the European utility requirements. KHNP is directing all its efforts to satisfy the safety standards of the global market. Through its global presence and cooperation with international organizations, KHNP has accumulated a track record of nuclear exports and is collaborating with many countries in Europe, Asia, and the Americas to create various business models. Based on a solid supply chain, extensive construction experience, and skilled manpower, KHNP has established the highest level of project management capabilities and IT-based management systems, which allow the construction of quality nuclear power plants in a timely manner. Moreover, Korea's solid infrastructure for nurturing human resources allows for systematic training programs, which have enabled provision of training services to the existing and potential customers. As such, KHNP continues to go the extra mile to grow together with its global partners. Energy has great power to enrich people's lives and move the world. Technology for making that energy and underlying passion are the greatest values that KHNP upholds. A company that powers the world with cutting-edge technology. A top 3 global energy leader. KHNP is ready to be your trusted global energy partner.
Hello, everyone. Let me start this panel. I thank KAIST and Sejong Institute for inviting us to this incredible conference. Actually, the U.S.-China competition is getting tougher, and Ukraine crisis actually worsened the U.S.-Russia relations. So the security environment that we are facing is full of, I think, uncertainties. So on the one hand, the DPRK is trying to advance its WMD program in order to gain perhaps second strike capabilities, as we discussed in the previous panel. And on the other hand, South Korea vowed to strengthen trilateral cooperation between the US, South Korea, and Japan. So the goal that we are pursuing is both denuclearization in the far future probably, and keeping deterrence in the near future. So the challenges and opportunities, this is the question that we are facing today. So I would like to introduce our distinguished panel for this panel. We are going to have first Sumi Terry as a keynote speaker. She'll give us 20 minutes keynote speech. And then we are going to have 3 presentations from Professor Ji-Won Hong, Professor Hwang Il-do, and Dr. Toby Dalton. Is Sumi Terry here with us? I think she...
I'm here. Somebody needs to turn the video for me.
Okay, then let me introduce Sumi Terry.
Could
Dr.
somebody-
Sumi Terry from Wilson Center. She is the director of the Asia program and the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy. And she was a senior fellow with the Korea Chair at the Center for the Strategic and International Studies. She served as a senior analyst on Korea issues at the CIA. And she did a lot of work on deterrence, nuclear policy, etc. So let me ask Sumi Terry to speak about for 20 minutes, and then we'll move on to have a panel discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Good morning to everyone in Seoul. Please, it's my pleasure to join you in this timely and important conference. And I want to thank NEREC and Sejong for giving me this opportunity to give this keynote address in this session on meeting the dual challenge on denuclearization and deterrence against nuclear-armed Korea. Let me not mince words here. On denuclearization, our efforts have failed, and there is no reason to expect that we'll do any better in the future. I'm sorry to start with such a gloomy picture, but that's where we are today in our denuclearization efforts. Dr. Cha in the earlier session gave us an excellent survey of Washington's denuclearization efforts vis-a-vis North Korea since the early 1990s. Dr. Jun also gave an overview of what went wrong, how we mishandled our denuclearization efforts, including our underestimation of the North's durability, capability, and desire for the North's nuclear armaments. And he talked about our inconsistent policies. So where we are today is that despite enormous economic difficulties that the North has been dealing with since it first closed the border with China in January 2020, it was the first country to do so. North Korea has been diligently working on its nuclear and missile programs, and it has made tremendous progress. Just this year alone, the North has tested 17 or is it 18 times, launching 33 missiles, including ICBMs. In the past year, Kim Jong-un has tested new missile technologies such as submarine-launched ballistic missile, a train-mounted ballistic missile, a new surface-to-air defense missile system, long-range strategic nuclear-capable cruise missiles, multiple hypersonic missiles, all in an effort to perfect its own missile and deterrent capabilities, to diversify its missile arsenal, and to defeat American missile defenses. Victor Cha mentioned that North Korea is looking for credible, survivable second strike capability. And what we have today, as Victor Cha said, is a runaway nuclear program. I think he described it quite correctly. That North Korea has amassed up to 60 nuclear warheads. Some say 30, some say 40, some say 50. The exact number varies, but that doesn't matter. Say up to 60, let's say 50. It's also producing fissile material, enough fissile material to make half dozen new bombs annually. A 2021 RAND Corporation report projected that North Korea would have around 200 nuclear weapons and hundreds of ballistic missiles stockpiled by 2027. That's only 5 years from now. Available evidence also suggests that North Korea can miniaturize these warheads to fit atop a missile, and Kim Jong-un is now likely moving on to the next phase, placing multiple warheads on a single ICBM. And this MIRV capability will be designed to frustrate US missile defenses, enhance, again, North Korea's ability to strike the United States mainland with nuclear missiles, making North Korea just one of the 3 countries in the world, alongside Russia and China, to possess this dangerous capability. That is the threat we are facing. And all indications is that North Korea is now technically prepared for another nuclear test. There will be a 7th nuclear test, as everybody knows. Punggye-ri was dismantled in 2018, but it has restored activity. Again, is prepared for another nuclear test, possibly next generation tactical nuclear weapon. And then talking about tactical nuclear weapons, this is another very concerning development. Since North Korea crossed basically the twin thresholds of developing thermonuclear weapon and flight-tested ICBM in 2017, North Korea is now focused on developing tactical nuclear weapons intended for use against targets on or near the peninsula. And a key risk there is that tactical nuclear weapons are aimed at ultimately decoupling the US-ROC alliance. Consider North Korea's last test. North Korea tested 8 missiles with different ranges from 5 places, right? From Sunan, Gyecheon, Dongchangli, Hamhung, to demonstrate its capability to deploy tactical nuclear weapons. These missiles are aimed at Pyeongtaek, Busan, variety of places in the south. So we cannot simply confidently say, oh, this is just an R&D. It's a testing of operational deployment. North Koreans are becoming more and more technical. They're looking at a smaller, lighter, miniaturized nuclear warheads on short-range missiles targeting South Korea. And what is now also concerning is that in recent months, Kim Jong-un or himself has been threatening to launch a preemptive attack. Okay, we've heard this before, and these threats are not necessarily so new. But renewed emphasis is still disconcerting. Kim Jong-un has ominously warned at a military parade on April 25th that the regime envisions a wider role for North Korea's nuclear arsenal beyond deterrence and self-defense. That the North will use weapons not just to prevent war, but preemptively for secondary purpose if the country's interest is threatened. This statement also comes after his own sister, Kim Yo-jong, had made similar kind of threats about potential preemptive use, threatening that South Korea could face extermination. This is right out of Putin's playbook. Putin has been using this kind of threat of nuclear escalation to deter the United States and the world from fully supporting Ukraine as it continues to assert Ukraine. So what is very concerning here is that Kim Jong-un could wrongly, in the future, perhaps under another US administration who might again consider troop withdrawal from South Korea, that, what's concerning is that Kim could calculate that by threatening preemptive use, that even if he uses tactical nuclear weapons preemptively, as long as he's holding on to a longer range ICBM in reserve and making threats against US mainland, that it would not necessarily lead to escalation. That, in fact, North Korea could deter nuclear retaliation in kind by Washington. Concern is that Kim may calculate that the United States does not have the will to defend South Korea. Now, that's not true. It's not certainly true of the Biden administration. And this seems to be a far-fetched scenario to many Americans. We have 28,000 Americans in South Korea. But the reality, I think, is this kind of North Korea's advancement in nuclear missile program and this kind of threats, combined with what's happening in Ukraine, it does enhance, or it does leave many South Koreans, and also, as I would say, many in Japan, concerned about their vulnerability as a nuclear weapons-free power facing nuclear-armed North Korea. So that is a concern. Now, so what is therefore needed is threat reduction and threat management, even though we are far off from successfully denuclearizing North Korea. Unfortunately, I'm concerned that in the foreseeable future, it doesn't appear like we can get North Korea to return to dialogue or anytime soon, which only further complicates our efforts to make any kind of progress on denuclearization front. This is, Victor talked about Biden administration has reached out 30 times to North Korea, anytime, any place, without precondition. But they're not interested in returning to talks. And I think in part, this is because despite serious internal difficulties that North Korea is facing, the current geopolitical situation or external environment is actually, I would argue, it's favorable for North Korea for further testing and advancing their nuclear missile program. What do I mean by favorable external environment for North Korea? It's not just intensifying US-China competition, which has been decidedly unhelpful from our perspective on China working with the United States on North Korea, but adding the war on Ukraine, which had made the world more bifurcated. We're seeing tightening relations between China and Russia, sort of uneasy alliance between Xi Jinping and Putin, which all points to a possible geopolitical realignment. And this has important implications globally and in the region, and of course on North Korea's calculation. For North Korea, first of all, the Ukraine war has only further underscored the importance of nuclear weapons for its security. I mean, they already knew that, but it has further reinforced it insofar as Russia would have been unlikely to initiate the war in Ukraine if Ukraine had not given up its nuclear weapons through the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, thereby further decreasing now prospect for North Korea's denuclearization. So the lessons of Iraq that the North Koreans drew from Iraq and Libya is that the leaders who give up nuclear weapons are at serious risk of being overthrown and killed. And this lesson is only reinforced by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But in addition to getting wrong lessons about the Ukraine war, for the North, I would say the external environment is favorable because the world is distracted. And amid this war, we have China and Russia to just being incredibly unhelpful, as I mentioned. We couldn't even get the United Nations Security Council to condemn an intercontinental ballistic missile launch. So North Korea has a sort of a wide open pathway for further testing and escalation without fear of any serious consequences. What is that going to stop them? Why would they stop? Previously, there were at least occasions when Beijing and Moscow were willing to join forces with the United States and its allies to punish North Korea following its provocation, even as they helped North Korea evade sanctions. For example, I'm thinking about the fall of 2017, in the height of President Trump's maximum pressure period, we've actually surprisingly seen China do more to implement sanctions. But now, again, amid intensifying US-China competition, and since the start of the Ukraine war, both Beijing and Moscow have refused to enforce existing sanctions, vetoed against any kind of further action against North Korea in the United Nations Security Council. And given this situation, even an additional nuclear test by North Korea would be unlikely to prompt any kind of serious reaction from China and Russia. So this makes a critical, this period marks a critical juncture in regional dynamics, with Beijing and Moscow now viewing Pyongyang's provocations as a means to gain advantage over Washington rather than concerning threat to regional stability. And given this worrisome situation, both in terms of the progress that North Korea has made in the WMD program that I talked about, and the geopolitical environment that I just mentioned, what do we do? And first, on denuclearization, I began my remarks by saying our efforts have failed. But I don't necessarily believe, so I don't necessarily believe that we can achieve denuclearization, to be very frank with you. But this does not mean as a policy that we should give up on denuclearization. And I think we can and should debate this, discuss this point. I think Toby Dalton has a different perspective, for example. There are scholars that make excellent points, arguments that since denuclearization is a very far-fetched goal, we need to drop this as a policy that Washington and Seoul should pursue, because it is just not a practical policy anymore. But for the time being, I do continue to believe that denuclearization still, as a goal, must be pursued, even if it's a very long term, and even just rhetorically, even though in reality we all know that it's a nuclear weapons power, just because there are also some risks that's associated with accepting North Korea as a nuclear state like Pakistan, right? It does bring about risk for there is risk to the US and the region, including a possibility of regional and global proliferation. But even more importantly, I would say it could further embolden North Korea to actually increase, not decrease, its provocations, including cyber attacks and so on. It also obviously sends a wrong message to other countries that's seeking to pursue nuclear capabilities. But this is a reasonable point for experts to discuss and deliberate on. What about deterrence, which is the second part of our topic for the session tonight? If we failed on denuclearization efforts, we could argue, though, that we, in a way, have succeeded in deterring North Korea from a high-level threats thus far. For example, North Korea invading South Korea, like the Korean War, or because we can credibly threaten to end the regime. Unfortunately, a high-end deterrence doesn't quite work for a lower-level threats or brinkmanship strategy. North Korea had a lot of room for lower-level provocations, and will continue to have running room in the future, simply because they know we're not going to launch World War III, another war in response to isolated artillery shelling or cyber attack or missile tests and so on, or even a nuclear test. Once we used to say intercontinental ballistic missile test was our red line, but despite all the rhetoric, including fire and fury rhetoric of 2017 during the Trump administration, even ICBM tests in 2017, or even more recently, or the sixth hydrogen bomb test, nuclear test in 2017, did not ultimately lead us to a conflict with North Korea. So the reality is that North Korea has long used to various provocations and brinkmanship tactics to achieve its objectives, and it will continue to do so. So let me just wrap up with some thoughts on policy options in this context, which you guys will discuss. I believe denuclearization still should be pursued as a long-term goal, but in the interim, we need to focus on threat reduction and deterrence. And we need to strengthen regional deterrence and defense capabilities, military readiness, counter-proliferation measures to deal with North Korea. Of course, this includes enhancing theater missile defense systems around the Korean Peninsula and Japan, and introducing more advanced air and naval assets to the region, developing and deploying more sophisticated US and South Korean strike capabilities, rotational presence of US Navy airships, and Navy ships at South Korean naval bases, And then, Victor Cha brought up this point about how he recommended students to study this more about what we mean by extended deterrence, Washington's extended deterrence. But we do need to reinforce Washington's extended deterrence against North Korea. But yes, I take his advice. We need to study more on that. And then sort of the robust military U.S.-ROC joint exercises. On joint exercises, the U.S. and South Korea should examine options for South Korean military units to participate in more robust military exercises. I think also across the Indo-Pacific region. This is in preparation for the 7th nuclear test, including there's Australia and Philippines and ASEAN nations and so on. It's good that South Korea recently sent its large-scale, I believe, a naval fleet to the U.S.-led multinational Rim of the Pacific exercise and will join the Pacific Dragon missile drills alongside the United States, Australia, Canada, and Japan this week. And then talking about Japan, this is my last point. U.S. and South Korea needs to work with Japan to bolster trilateral cooperation. I know this is sometimes a very sensitive issue for our Korean colleagues, some Japanese too, but with the new Yoon administration who said that they are interested in repairing ties with Japan, there is a small window of opportunity here with Yoon and Kishida for Seoul and Tokyo to take steps to reconciliation and bolster trilateral cooperation to improve deterrence for North Korea. And then, of course, an important step towards this effort is to improve trilateral cooperation, is to encourage normalizing intelligence sharing, Kochusomia, and so on. And also it involves trilateral exercises with U.S. For air and air defense and ballistic missile defense, BMD, to launch combined exercises that really demonstrate the integration of their collective capabilities. I have some other thoughts, but I know we're sort of running out of time. So I will sort of just conclude there. But we have to work together to enhance deterrence while still leaving room for door open to dialogue and diplomacy. On this point, I agree with Victor and the previous panel. Door to diplomacy should not be closed, while we should remain resolute in the face of North Korea's provocation and its WMD buildup. Seoul and Washington should not be afraid to talk to Pyongyang. If North Korea does decide to return to negotiation, U.S. should test the water to see if it will be possible to conclude some sort of interim deal that will freeze North Korea's WMD program in a verifiable manner in return for partial sanctions relief. If nothing else, at least the willingness to engage with North Korea in such a limited negotiations will at least enable Washington to win the battle of narrative by showing the world that we are interested in peace and that the primary obstacle to agreement lies in Pyongyang. I'll wrap up there. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you, Dr. Sumitari. I guess some of the students in this conference room may have questions for you, but let me ask you one question. Obviously, the DPRK is not interested in resuming talks with the U.S. and others, and China and Russia are not really cooperative. So the option that we have to think about is probably slowing down the speed of North Korea's nuclear armament. Then my question is, what kind of additional measures that the like-minded countries can introduce to further strengthen, for example, export control of dual-use items for developing North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles? And how do you see the effectiveness of these additional measures without the help from China and Russia? Do you have any other thoughts, Dr. Sumitari?
Yeah, as I've said earlier, that's all good. I support that. It's just that, unfortunately, the reality is that at the present time, we do not really have good options beyond deterrence, seeking to reduce South Korea, Japan, working together trilaterally, bilaterally, and strengthening alliance relationships, looking to reinforce U.S. extended deterrence, and so on. Unfortunately, one of the learning lessons from the failed Hanoi summit for North Korea was that it needed to perfect its nuclear arsenal first or at least for them to hit certain technical benchmarks before it can return before they should return to dialogue, before it can really get anything from the United States. I think North Koreans watched the Biden administration sort of in the beginning when they first came in, and they quickly concluded that they're not going to get much out of the Biden administration. So this means any future dialogue with the North will only come from us hanging tough, and us actually, we talked about maybe pressure tactics does not work. We talked about in the last panel, like sanctions can only go so far. It's not going to make North Korea denuclearize or take any of those steps. I fully agree. But I do think that for us to increase our leverage, we need to do what we can in terms of, our deterrence capabilities, enhancing it, and for us to hang tough until North Korea is ready to return to dialogue. We really don't have any other option. I know this is a deeply unsatisfying answer, but it's the truth.
All right, thank you very much. I would like to see if we have any other questions from the students. Yes, in the back.
So, has North Korea ever expressed any fear from China in regards to their sovereignty, or any credible fears? Because China has shown a long-standing interest in the Korean Peninsula, and even helped defend North Korea in the past.
Has North Korea ever expressed fear? Fear is a very strong word, but I buy your point that North Korea is, it's an uneasy relationship with North Korea, between North Korea and China. North Koreans cannot stand that they have to rely on China, and that China is the world's basically only remaining patron that really supports North Korea. And you're right. I do think that China could have designs. When you even talk about future unification on North Korea. So I'm not sure if the fear is exactly the right word, but I do think that they have anxiety, uneasiness, and there's no love lost between North Korea and China. It's a marriage of a convenience, and for now, because again, China is the only country that's really in a position to help North Korea.
Right.
Hi, I was wondering if I could ask a career question. So my name is Hannah Harris. I'm from the United States, and I'm a master's student at the Middlebury Institute in Monterey. And I focus my research on North Korea. And I wanted to ask, since you've had a career both in the CIA and outside in the public sector, do you have any advice for an aspiring intelligence analyst in terms of how the paths differ when you're doing work that's classified and you cannot communicate with other people outside of your organization, versus working in more of an academic ecosystem where you're free to access certain types of data and you're able to communicate with people? Because from what I understand, it's very different when you do analysis for the government versus analysis that's more open. Thank you.
Well, that's really an excellent question. And my answer to that is do both. It has it will bring you different opportunities and there are different strengths, weaknesses. First, yes, dealing with classified, working in the intelligence community, not that you learn, particularly when you're dealing with North Korea, not that you know so much more than, let's say, that's out there. Dr. Charles of the world is CSIS or Brookings or CFR or Wilson Center. It's not that you know so much more, although you might at some point, some things you do, you know the nuclear test is coming, or you might have some more obviously information, but you know what you don't know. That's the key thing. So one of the joys of having full access to classified information and going to these kind of conferences and then hearing somebody like me just blathering on and acting like they know what they're talking about. And I would say, wait a minute, you don't know that, you don't have that information. So at least I was clear about what we didn't know. Like nobody knew and people are just academics are pontificating. So there was something that was there's frustrating that you couldn't talk to other people, but there was a good sense about at least this is all available information, you're studying it. And then it's a good training for you as you really develop your expertise on whatever issue, whether you're focusing on just is it internal issue or external, is it a functional issue like cyber? At least, you get to really spend that time honing your skills, learning and becoming an expert on something. And then when you leave that environment, I actually, I really miss one thing that I missed was, again, having that confidence that people didn't know what they're talking about because there's just no way to know that. And then miss going into work and every morning, I read my traffic, right? Like 10,000 pieces of information that still came in overnight, every embassy cable, every, satellite report, every report from DOD, every from, human intelligence, whatever it is, So I'm used to reading the cable and sort of trying to say, okay, what do I know today? So I miss that. But what is really great is this kind of a collaboration with each other that you can talk about it and really and collaborate and work together. And in that sense, there's also great satisfaction that comes from that. So, I would say as someone who's starting out, it's not a matter of, if you have an opportunity to work in intelligence community, there are great benefits to that. So enjoy that. And then when you eventually leave, you are in this think tank space. And I'll just say the last thing, what I do enjoy about think tank space is that it is a sort of the bridge. It's sort of the bridge that connects academia and the policy community. Every work that the think tank does is not just research, like it does have a policy recommendations and policy implications. And we are still looking for actionable, implementable, timely analysis that will support policymaking.
Okay, due to time limit, I'll take one more question from the gentleman, please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I am Iftikhar Ali from Pakistan and a NEREC fellow here. I have a couple of questions. Whether, there is 10th review conferences and petty review conferences going on. We are facing the Ukraine crisis and the ongoing developments of, DPR case, second strike capabilities, missile tests, and, they're further enhancing their nuclear program. So, in the face of 10th review conference in the UN, whether international community will be able to do anything to reverse the withdrawal of North Korea from NPT. And second, since North Korea is, some sort of threat to its neighbors, especially South Korea and Japan, and with respect to past engagements of international community, especially the United States with DPRK, to what extent the North Korea's nuclear program can weaken Japan and South Korea's resolve not to pursue their own nuclear weapons, and to what extent U.S. will ensure its extended deterrence, the credibility of extended deterrence in the wake of the U.S. commitments to Ukraine. So what Washington needs to do more to ensure its allies in, especially South Korea, that it is still committed to ensure its, security umbrella. Thank you.
So I'll keep my remarks short because I know we're running out of time. Your first question, if there's anything that we can do to reverse, I really, my honest, candid opinion is no. I don't think we can really reverse it. I don't think North Korea is going to withdraw from or return to NPT or not give up nuclear weapons. They weren't going to do it anyway. I made a point about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Just put a nail on the head in terms of that. Again, we can maybe freeze it. Maybe we can cap it. Maybe we can not let it continue to just balloon up. But I don't think we can really get there where we're seeing full denuclearization. On your second question on North Korea's threat to its neighbors, how would it weaken the resolve? Let's put it this way. I think it actually strengthens the resolve from South Korea and Japan. It could, for seeking their own capability at some point. When we talked about, South Koreans are talking a little bit more, the sort of buzz about bringing tactical nuclear weapons back, or you're hearing this thing about like NATO-style sharing nuclear weapons, and so on. This used to be more of kind of a French opinion, but now more and more people are at least talking about it, and then you're also seeing public opinion kind of sort of moving in that direction, even though those are not really detailed polls, and if the South Korean public really knew what it entails, I'm not sure if they would necessarily support it. So the problem is, once North Korea is really accepted as a nuclear weapons power, you say you're from Pakistan, like a Pakistan model, right? Pakistan tests nuclear weapons test in 1998, and then there's 9/11 and 9/11, and then we normalize relations with Pakistan. That's the model. But the issue is, once we go there, and then imagine a future U.S. administration, like the previous administration, who talked about putting troops out of South Korea, more isolationist, America first kind of president in power. This combined effect, we're kidding ourselves if we think this is not going to have some sort of, raise a question mark in South Korea and Japan about what they should be pursuing. So it really depends on multiple factors, but that's how I would answer that question. Your last point about Washington's commitment in terms of the extended nuclear deterrence, I would say for now, there's no stronger commitment and resolve than having 28,500 American soldiers in South Korea right now. I mean, what more commitment do you need than that? So that's how I would answer your questions. Thank you for that, and thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure talking to you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Sumitari, for sharing your insights with us. Okay, actually we are behind the schedule, but I would like to give each speaker 20 minutes for their presentations, and we will not have a break, and we will move on to Q&A session afterwards, all right? Let me introduce Dr. Ji-won Hwang from University of Seoul. He is Professor of International Relations at the University of Seoul and served as several audiovisual positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Unification, and many others. Professor Hwang, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. This is Ji-won Hwang, and thanks again for inviting me here at the wonderful seminar. Then I didn't expect that there are so many the audiences here actually. This presentation is a part of my research in international relations. And of course, this research is policy related, but actually this is quite theoretical in international relations. but I'm sure that most of you understand the meaning of the nuclear deterrence, MAD, and the other the nuclear postures by the nuclear powers. Okay, let me start. Actually, the North Korea has long insisted that the purpose of the nuclear program is to deter the United States from invading North Korea. Now I know that there is the American in this room actually, but I don't think that the Americans, most Americans believe that their government's gonna invade North Korea, but that's the North Korean thinking. For example, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un once said that, quote, "Everyone should take pride in having consolidated firmly the powerful nuclear war deterrent despite hostile forces' persistent pressure and sanctions," unquote. So Pyongyang may want to keep nuclear weapons, as a type of insurance card against U.S. Intervention and invasion, but I wonder whether the nuclear weapons, provide North Korea with the mutual assured destruction, so-called MAD, MAD, or has the North Korean, conventional military posture, failed in deterring the U.S. ROK alliance? Or are the North Korean security and economic situations improving after they developed the nuclear weapons? So Pyongyang, has long believed in the power of the nuclear deterrence and sought to possess its own nuclear deterrence capability against the United States. So the logic of the nuclear deterrence, especially in the rational deterrence in international relations theory, explains that the nuclear deterrence can minimize the chances of military conflict, because the threat of MAD, mutually assured destruction, discourages the nuclear armed states from using force against each other. So this is what Pyongyang believes in terms of their nuclear the weapons. So North Korea announced that MAD has started working against Washington since 2017. That you remember that the North Korea conducted its sixth nuclear test in September 2017, and then Hwasong 15, ICBM class ballistic, the missile in the end of the November 2017, and then they started, coming back to the negotiating table. Kim Jong-un once, said that the quote, now that the DPRK's capability to strike the very heart of the United States at any given time has been physically proved, the United States would find it more difficult to dare attack the DPRK, unquote. This is the meaning of the MAD in the North Korea. So although we are not sure actually whether North Korea has really completed the technology and the capabilities needed for MAD, in MAD, with the MAD, Pyongyang can launch a devastating, nuclear second strike, capability, even after massive nuclear first strike, by Washington. So the North Korea declared that it now has achieved its own nuclear defense capability and completed MAD against the Washington. So North Korea believe that nuclear weapons give them some freedom of action and make Washington and Seoul and also the Tokyo more hesitant, in a crisis on the Korean peninsula. Kim Jong-un and North Korean leaders, believe that even though the United States is wielding the nuclear stick and going wild for another war, it will not dare to invade North Korea because it currently has a powerful nuclear deterrence, MAD. It's not meaning, I don't mean crazy or something like that in terms of MAD, you know that, right? MAD, mutually assured destruction. Kim Jong-un also, declared no first use of nuclear weapons, which means that they are pursuing the deterrence, not, the offensive purpose. He confirmed that North Korea would not abuse nuclear weapons as a responsible nuclear power unless the aggressive enemy uses it. Of course, Kim Jong-un recently talked about the second mission of their nuclear weapons. It's not clear yet, but maybe it may include the nuclear use during wartime, but we need to think more about that. But still, Kim Jong-un said that their first mission is about deterrence. So the possession of nuclear weapons, has not substantial. But the problem is that the possession of nuclear weapons has not substantially increased its security, but worsened its internal, economic situation and external security environment. That's my puzzle, and then that's my the argument against the conventional wisdom on the North Korean nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons. So my presentation argues that the Pyongyang's pursuit of nuclear deterrence is an example of over-deterrence, superfluous, which has paradoxically produced unintended consequences. So because nuclear weapons do not add as much deterrence capability as Pyongyang expect, Its conventional military capability has provided as much deterrence capability as nuclear weapons have, and is no less credible in preventing the United States from invading North Korea. Of course, the nuclear weapons are not, much credible in preventing the United States from invading North Korea. But as opposed to, the North Korean thinking, this I'm gonna explain why. Even with nuclear weapons, it presumably, assured. Presumably, the assured retaliation capability, according to the VP Narang's, categorization, is not credible incredibly enough compared to the America's, supreme nuclear, the capability. So the problem is that MAD is not likely working between Washington and Pyongyang unless under the condition of MAD, according to nuclear deterrence theory. A nuclear armed state has a nuclear second strike capability even after its opponent's massive nuclear first strike. It's the assured retaliation strategy, as VP Narang said that. But the thing is that a few nuclear weapons do not, necessarily mean the nuclear deterrence, do not necessarily mean the MAD, mutually assured destruction. Although many influential arguments in the literature, hold that the mere existence of a single nuclear weapon is sufficient to deter conflict is kind of the book, that Bob Jarvis is the meaning of nuclear revolution, something like that. But actually, I think that this is an existential bias from the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So this line of thinking has causes many scholars and policymakers to believe that even ambiguous or non-weaponized nuclear forces should deter adversaries from initiating conflict, and it is the reason why the United States, the South Korea, worry about North Korea. But the thing is that this would be empirically, the false at the local level or the regional level, not the global level, like the Cold War, U.S. and Soviet Union relation. Regional nuclear powers like India, Pakistan, and Israel, have achieved widely, different the deterrence result with their nuclear arsenal, and they required actually a lot more, nuclear weapons, and took actually the other nuclear postures, which I will explain later. For the VP Narang's categorizations, it's like the assured retaliation posture, or the catalytic strategy, or the asymmetric escalation strategy, something like that. So a nation's acquisition of nuclear weapons like North Korea does not always produce a uniform nuclear deterrence effect. Several experiences from nuclear powers like the South Asia, for example, show that nuclear weapons may weaken crisis stability rather than play a deterrent or some nuclear states were less successful in deterring adversaries than others which can be seen from the relations between India and Pakistan. So more recent literature in nuclear deterrence in international relations do not simply assume MAD between nuclear powers. So they explain how nuclear deterrence and coercion will fail between a symmetric nuclear power, not the symmetric nuclear powers like the United States and Soviet Union, the asymmetric nuclear powers between U.S. and North Korea, right? And what will make this failure more likely? So in particular, Professor Lieber and Press showed that recently that changes in military technology are eroding the foundation of nuclear deterrence. So weak nations facing more wealthy and technologically advanced adversaries, so North Korea facing United States, will find it very difficult to secure their arsenals because the military technology such as guidance systems, sensors, data processing, communication, artificial intelligence, and a host of other products of the computer revolution continue to improve, quote and unquote, by the liberal press. So, on the other hand, according to the recent research on the role of nuclear weapons in coercive diplomacy, that if many scholars say that if you have nuclear weapons, you are well positioned to conduct a coercive diplomacy with your nuclear weapons. But the thing is that nuclear weapons do not help states achieve better result in coercive diplomacy because it is extremely difficult to make the coercive, the nuclear threat available. So I think that it is the nuclear over deterrence. So it means that the MAD does not work between the asymmetric nuclear powers. So if a weak nation develops a small amount of nuclear weapons and expect MAD against a much stronger opponent, like the case of North Korea against the United States, so maybe it is their wishful thinking and does not likely increase as much deterrence capability as they hope. So furthermore, if the nation possesses a significant amount of conventional military posture and then acquiring nuclear weapons, would be, I think, that over deterrence, that which arouses a situation of security dilemma. So the unintended consequence, then its nuclear deterrence strategy is a failure because the possession of nuclear weapons rather decreases than increase security, because of the security dilemma. So this redundancy of deterrence, will likely incur on the audience cost in most countries, maybe mostly in the most democratic, countries. That's why the most democratic countries do not go nuclear like South Korea and Japan, but it's possible in North Korea, because Kim Jong-un is a personalist dictator, and the personalist dictators are, remarkably, insulated from the punishment at the hands of the domestic audience. So they can take gambles on developing nuclear weapons and producing over deterrence, redundancy, redundant security, with less concern for the domestic aftermath. So, policy implication from my research. First of all, the disillusioning Pyongyang's MAD. So, given the recurring failures of the denuclearization negotiation, Pyongyang is not likely to give up its nuclear weapons program, but however, it is still, I think, that necessary for the Kim Jong-un regime to be disillusioned with its own nuclear deterrence capability and mad against the United States. So one important policy implication, I think, is that the international community, including U.S., Korea, and other countries, need to get Pyongyang to think again about the credibility of its nuclear deterrence. We always say about the credibility of U.S. Extended deterrence to the Korean Peninsula. So we also need to think about the credibility of the North Korea's nuclear deterrence and nuclear capability. So how can the North Korean regime be persuaded to change its mindset? And I think that rather than emphasizing or overemphasizing the increasing threat by nuclear and missile tests, so we need to make Pyongyang realize that its nuclear weapons neither dramatically change the balance of power on the Korean Peninsula nor beat the American supreme nuclear posture. So this is quite plausible because North Korea is currently, predicted to possess a small number of nuclear weapons, and they believe that they can threaten nuclear retaliation against the United States, maybe so. disillusioning nuclear deterrence, their nuclear illusion, disillusioning may be the first, I think, an important step to changing the nature of North Korea's nuclear game. Second is catalyzing China. So another policy implication is about the Chinese role. So how can China be persuaded to help North Korea realize the illusion of its own nuclear deterrence capability? As I said before, the Pyongyang strategy of nuclear posture is, I think, that assured retaliation is deterrence strategy. But this is not realistic because matter is not working. The assured retaliation needs the secure second strike capabilities that can credibly threaten nuclear retaliation. But although North Korea, likely have maybe undiscovered nuclear site, but I don't think they have that amount of unknown, nuclear capability. So Beijing may know this and feel the need to change the Pyongyang's nuclear strategy. Beijing would be maybe much happier if Pyongyang, does not pursue the unilateral strategy of assured retaliation. So against this backdrop, China may want North Korea to depend on it strategically, and North Korea can attempt to catalyze, China on its behalf, So if Pyongyang is disillusioned with the credibility of its nuclear deterrence capability, Pyongyang may want to catalyze, China to intervene in the crisis with the United States when they believe that the United States is going to attack North Korea. So another, maybe, although neither the Beijing or Pyongyang, likely choose this strategy, this policy at the moment, unfortunately, but I think that it appears to have the least risk of the inadvertent use of nuclear weapons by North Korea. Third policy implication is to avoid the asymmetric escalation. If the Pyongyang, adopts the catalytic strategy and using the China, it will prevent Pyongyang from moving toward the much riskier and scarier, option. As I noted before, the Kim Jong-un recently mentioned about the second mission of the North Korean nuclear force, and that which goes beyond, just the deterrent. The second mission is about, the first use of nuclear weapons, something like that, during the wartime. Although it is not clear yet what the second mission means, but it may include an aggressive nuclear first use policy with short-range missiles and tactical nuclear weapons. So Kim Jong-un recently talked much about the tactical nuclear weapons and also the short-range missiles. So in fact, Kim Jong-un announced that at the 8th Party Congress last year that he would develop small tactical nuclear weapons, medium range and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Just 1 minute. So it's important to avoid, North Korea, adoption of the asymmetric escalation, the strategy. But North Korea may be seeking for a transition of nuclear strategy from assured retaliation now to the asymmetric escalation in the future, which would carry, extreme risk. So asymmetric escalation strategy intends to deter the conventional attacks by presenting a credible threat of a first nuclear strike against military and civilian target, and responding to the rapid the asymmetric escalation. Under this the strategy, Pyongyang will more likely pre-delegate the authority of nuclear strike to lower level the commanders in the field to make the threat of the first use nuclear weapons credible and deter the American South Korean conventional invasion. So Pyongyang would likely operationalize nuclear weapons as a war fighting for nuclear deterrence. So, but the thing is, we are now a very difficult situation. The United States and South Korea need to strengthen deterrence by punishment, not only by deterrence by the denial. to block the Pyongyang from employing the asymmetric escalation, which is the more risky. So it is less risky to get North Korea to depend on China than to fear them to fear abandonment from China and moving toward the riskier, the nuclear posture. So if China and North Korean relations deteriorate in a the irrevocable manner, however, the North Korean leaders may be more likely believe that they have no other option but to develop a more aggressive nuclear strategy like the asymmetric escalation. So the problem is that, as you understand, that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to encourage the China to play a reliable role in the North Korean issue and for us to resolve this issue. Although the U.S. China the strategic conflict and Russian invasion of Ukraine make it very increasingly difficult to persuade China to cooperate. It is still, I think, that worth a try because it is really dangerous for the North Korea. Let just the North Korea to move toward the asymmetric escalation, which is more the riskier, much riskier one. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hong. We may have more time to discuss North Korea's nuclear doctrine in the Q&A session. Next, let me invite Professor Hwang Il-do from Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Before joining KNDA, he worked as a staff writer and research fellow at the Donga-Ilbo Media Group for 16 years. And he was also a visiting fellow at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gina. Thank you for having me on this wonderful table. My name is Hwang Il-do, and my major is mostly about nuclear deterrence, military security, or North Korea issue, etc. So it's a quite honor to share my little take on this situation on the Korean Peninsula. Actually, basically, the presentation that I prepared shares some theoretical background with Professor Hwang here, another Hwang here. So I had to skip some part of my presentation as much as possible, which is common to the prior presentation. Okay, let me start in this way. An overview of the nuclear missile activities in 10 years since Kim Jong-un took power. We can say that the North Korea's WMD activities can be divided into two tenets. The first one is development tests that fire only one shot or maybe two shots, and actual drills or demonstrations that fire multiple shots at the same time simultaneously. One thing that we have to remember is that the development tests accounted for only 36% of total activities from 2010 to 2015, the first 5 years of the Kim Jong-un tenure. And the ratio skyrocketed to the 84% in 2016 to 2021, which means that the Pyongyang's WMD development and technological progress started in earnest from 2016. So DPRK's WMD development from 2016 and 17 was mainly focused on the ICBM and the strategic nuclear capabilities, including alleged H-bomb, mainly targeted on the US mainland. However, Pyongyang's recent move since the Hanoi failure in 2019 has been focusing on the advancement of the short-range ballistic missiles with MARV, maneuvering range vehicle technology, and solid fuel engine plus TEL, the mobile launchers. Furthermore, from last year, Pyongyang is trying to add tactical nuclear weapons or low-yield warheads in order to make their nuclear weapon a war-fighting capabilities, as Professor Hwang here mentioned earlier, rather than a punishment deterrence-only kind of a package. Yes, it is quite a rapid progress. However, it is also true that this direction is not that surprising, mainly because whole this trend was, we can say that it was expected even from the 2017, maybe because we can find some sort of common phenomenon from the precedent countries. Let me put it this way. Basically, what Pyongyang is trying to do can be more salient when we think about a general pattern of nuclear doctrine's evolution of preceding nuclear states. There are so many ways to categorize nuclear doctrines, but two criteria, such as denial or punishment deterrence and forced use or no forced use, can provide a very clear framework or typology. So this is the, from this figure, we can see there is a universal pattern that countries with conventional inferiority sharing land border with the potential foes evolve their doctrine into the direction of denial, deterrence, and forced use kind of the package. So it's the upper right side of the table. This direction is basically about utilizing tactical nuclear weapons to offset their conventional, the conventional superiority of the enemies, or maximizing the deterrence effect of their nuclear arsenal by raising up the chance of nuclear escalation with hair-triggered deployment or preparedness posture. So, yes, the most evident case is Pakistan. We have the Pakistani delegation here. And in 1990s, before its multiple nuclear tests in 1998, their deterrence package was focused on the tacit threatening of massive retaliation. But from early 2010s, when they began to worry about the conventional inferiority caused by India's cold start doctrine, Pakistan also changed their nuclear doctrine more aggressively with a tactical nuclear weapon, the option enhancing or full spectrum doctrine, they call it. The same kind of nuclear warfighting doctrines, rather than massive punishment retaliation, can be found in the case of a flexible response doctrine of the US NATO in 1960s, and Russia's move toward the so-called escalate to de-escalate doctrine. Russia's doctrine was obviously shown off via the recent tacit threatening of the possibility of nuclear use with respect to the Ukrainian situation. Pyongyang's recent move is clearly mimicking the precedents, completing tactical nuclear weapons and threatening to use them as warfighting capabilities to countervail their conventional inferiority on the peninsula. From April of this year to most recently, the regime sent out a series of signaling in this vein, such as a declaratory policy, posture, and NC2, nuclear command and control. First, Kim Jong-un himself officially mentioned the second mission, as Professor Hwang Il mentioned earlier, namely nuclear warfighting capability. In April 17, they disclosed a new tactical guidance weapon system, and the test was accompanied by field commanders, including artillery units. So this is the first delivery vehicle that North Korea mentioned that it will be equipped with tactical nuclear warheads. This is the first one. So that implies that it can and will delegate the launch of these tactical nuclear weapons to the field commanders so that it can be used anytime when the battle situation on the front line is seriously unfavorable for them. Basically, this evolution of nuclear doctrine is following the precedents, as I mentioned, in terms of how to countervail the overwhelming conventional inferiority. For example, NATO's flexible response was about using tactical nuclear weapons to countervail WTO, the Warsaw Treaty Organization's superior ground forces. And Pakistan's deterrence model after 2010 was also about using tactical nuclear weapon, even within the Pakistan's territory after Indian forces crossing the line of control. However, in order to realize this possibility, in order to materialize this possibility, there should be one assumption, presumption, or prerequisite fulfilled. The US nuclear response or retaliation must be restrained, even in the case of Pyongyang's initial limited use of nuclear weapons on the military target. Without this presumption, whole Pyongyang's tactical use doctrine would be meaningless, mainly because it would be a suicidal mission for the regime and for the country and for the Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader himself. So how is this presumption possible? Maybe you can think about the 3 points of North Korea's wishful thinking. First one is about the U.S. extended deterrence or nuclear umbrella credibility issue. It can be restricted if North Korea can nuke U.S. mainland. Well, this is very famous question from de Gaulle, like will U.S. risk New York to say Paris or so, things like that. So we can say that in this case, they may think that this whole kind of the strategic nuclear capability against the U.S. mainland or second strike capability against the U.S. mainland is a kind of guarantee that makes the use of tactical nuclear weapons possible on the Korean Peninsula. Second point is about a physical difficulty of attacking North Korea with ICBMs. And you can see this picture here. Actually, it's not mine. It's from the Joshua Plus presentation. As you can see, all missiles launched toward North Korea from the U.S. mainland, it's mostly from the Montana or Wyoming, must pass through Chinese and or Russian territory. If Washington has potential concern about accidental nuclear escalation with these two countries, maybe then massive nuclear retaliation with ICBM can be limited. It is kind of another point of the U.S. and North Korea's wishful thinking. Lastly, we can think about the proportionality norm of international law that can constrain massive nuclear use toward a small country like North Korea, especially when the North use a North Korea weapon in a very limited manner without serious civilian casualty. As you remember, Obama administration policy direction, including the world without nuclear weapons, might mean that the U.S. response could be limited to the conventional level. And even after the NPR 2018 and lowered SLBM deployment, U.S. response can be limited to the tactical or lowered nuclear level from Pyongyang's view. If the U.S. response is proportional or proportionate, the escalation threshold can be drawn between the tactical and strategic nuclear exchange, not between conventional and nuclear warfare. Therefore, it would be possible to avoid a massive nuclear retaliation from the United States, even after their forced use of tactical nuclear weapon, and it would be possible to offset the conventional inferiority with their limited nuclear arsenal. Maybe this is the only small window of opportunity for North Korea to make their nuclear weapon militarily useful. But we also have a very strong counter-argument that the whole this potential calculation of Pyongyang is simply a wishful thinking. About MAD, as Professor Huang already mentioned, they declared that they already completed MAD situation with the United States. But the Washington's view is totally different. And especially given the North Korea's small or territory, and it means that their ICBM launch angle is very narrow. So basically, whole damage limitation options like disarming first strike or missile defense is quite possible and sufficient from the Washington's view. Contrary to the US-USSR mutually assured destruction during the Cold War, for NK, neither assured destruction nor assured retaliation is possible, and Washington estimates that the gap is difficult to narrow down, even in the future as well. So as for the trajectory issue of the US ICBMs, we have to remember that more than 60% of US nuclear forces on SLBMs, and ICBMs and strategic bombers are just auxiliary means. It means that formation potential difficulty, technological difficulty, is not a big deal from the perspective of the decision makers in Washington. Likewise, there is a tremendous uncertainty about whether US nuclear response will be limited or proportional. Actually, the question whether the nuclear war can be controlled or not has a very long history of controversy within the US nuclear policy community. However, the basic attitude of the US military for the question has been negative quite consistently. Because of the unique nature of nuclear war, once the weapon is detonated, the situation will develop very rapidly to the end, and controlling is not possible at all because there's huge uncertainty. Furthermore, basic concept of US DoD to cope with cope with similar cases of other countries that I mentioned earlier has been like Jim Mary's comment on the DOE meeting for preparing an NPL 2018 as follows. When they go low, we go high, which means that even if potential for use of nuclear weapon in a very limited manner, U.S. response would not be proportional or limited. Therefore, how to break down the whole wishful thinking of Pyongyang should be priority number one principle in order to make a concrete deterrence message toward the regime. The key is accurately understand the North Korea's escalation concept and devise adequate counter strategies. If the North is wary of a strategic nuclear escalation, it is important to threaten this possibility as much as possible to show off massive retaliation options. While the North is attempting to lower the escalation threshold between conventional and tactical nuclear warfare, the ROK-US must stop it by emphasizing that there is no threshold between tactical and strategic nuclear exchanges level. Even if tactical nuclear weapons were used, the next stage would be uncontrollable, unproportional, and go all the way or something like that. So lastly, let me add some prospects for the near future as a conclusion of my presentation. So North Korea announced a 5-year plan for weapon development at the 2021 Party Congress, such as tactical nuclear weapon, solid fuel ICBM, and nuclear propelled submarine, and so on. Considering the potential force structure that they have in mind, the ultimate goal seems to be a long-range SLBMs, the credible second strike capability, the more credible second strike capability that complements the limitation of SRBM and ICBMs that I mentioned earlier. But the technological hurdle for this job is very high, as you already know, which means it will take a long time, maybe a decade. For the time being, a modeling through kind of the playbook might be possible utilizing China and Russia's political and economic support. This calculation is called a new Cold War diplomacy in North Korea state media recently. However, a concern about excessive dependence on China, as Sumitari mentioned, may lead them to contemplate a negotiation option with the United States, similar to 2018. Okay, maybe there is some sort of
Missing, right?
yeah. Anyway, so on the other hand, we also have to remember that Pyongyang's intention goal of the negotiation phase in 2018 was about stimulating Beijing via hedging with the United States. So, and the result is quite successful, maybe too much successful. So, and given the intensifying the U.S.-China competition and U.S.-Russia confrontation, there seems to be no such a political demand for stimulation China or Russia at the point or in the near future. So therefore, we can say that the probability of the negotiation phase might be not that great at all, especially compared to before. But maybe we have some very little uncertainty or the question, what if Donald Trump returns in 2028? Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Huang. Last but not least, let me introduce Dr. Toby Dalton, who patiently waited for his turn. Dr. Toby Dalton is a senior fellow and co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining Carnegie, he served as senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. Dr. Toby Dalton, I know it is very late in the evening in DC, so thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Gina. Good to see you. And thanks for the invitation to join the NEREC-Sejong conference again. I wish I was there with you in person and headed for a good lunch. So seeing as I'm standing between you and your lunch, I'll try to be fairly direct and hopefully sort of whet your appetite a little bit. Managing deterrence and denuclearization is a topic that I think can be quite complex and detailed as the previous very good presentations showed. But I think there's also value in trying to simplify and to be direct with the analysis, which is what I will try to do. Both the first panel and Sue's remarks stressed the consistent policy failures to arrest North Korea's nuclear program. Let me go further. I think current policies are actively destabilizing, making the situation with North Korea more dangerous while increasing the chances of proliferation by South Korea and Japan. Let me briefly unpack that. Continuing to emphasize denuclearization is not just out of sync with the reality of North Korea as a state that is going to possess nuclear weapons for a long time. It has other destabilizing effects. I think for Kim Jong-un, denuclearization shows that the US and South Korea don't accept the deterrence status quo and threaten regime change. And how does he respond? Arsenal growth, changes in nuclear posture, development of tactical nuclear weapons, as the previous presentations laid out. I would also reiterate here Jun Bong-gun's remarks earlier that this approach has effectively incentivized North Korea to pursue nuclear weapons. If we continue with denuclearization as the primary feature of our policy, nuclear dangers will continue to grow. Not surprisingly, as the North Korea threat has grown, you have concerns also in Japan and South Korea, understandably increasing, and this puts a much greater stress on US extended deterrence. This exacerbates a related problem. For too long, the US and partners have given too much emphasis to extended nuclear deterrence as the solution to North Korea's nuclear proliferation. This complicates, exacerbates the perpetual challenge for the US to assure South Korean and Japanese publics and officials that it will follow through on its defense commitments despite the threats from North Korea, that the nuclear umbrella will not be torn or tattered, as some have suggested. And of course, this also then, the emphasis on nuclear deterrence feeds North Korea's nuclear buildup. This is a problem that has been long in the making. I think we're now in something of a capabilities trap, an extended deterrence trap of our own making. So how do we adjust current policies to get out of this trap? This is first and foremost a political problem, in my view. No leader wants to admit failure of denuclearization or accept deterrence with North Korea. But the growing strategic risks of sustaining the current policies are worth the political cost, in my opinion, of changing. So first, South Korea, the US, and Japan together need to rethink what the primary threat is. It is no longer, and hasn't been for at least a decade, about proliferation. Now it is about avoiding war, mainly through deterrence. This needs to be done through alliances in ways that assure US allies about commitments, in ways that stabilize the region, and create openings for diplomacy with North Korea to restrain competition. And also in ways that reduce the stimulus for proliferation by Japan and South Korea. More nuclear weapons in the region are not a good solution, in my opinion, contrary to what many seem to think, to include some notable US academics who have speculated about the wisdom of South Korea acquiring its own nuclear weapons. Earlier, Jun Bong-gun talked about 4 policy pillars. So in the spirit of simplifying, let me reduce that to 2, deterrence and risk reduction. I want to be specific here about risk reduction and not Sue's formulation of threat reduction, because I think there's an important difference, which I'll come to in a little bit. Deterrence and risk reduction are not new ideas, and neither is it a new idea to pair them together. If you look at the US-Soviet détente from the late 1960s and what followed from that, basically it created the off-ramp from nuclear competition, nuclear arms racing via arms control. We have to be clear that we can't control when and even whether North Korea might re-engage in diplomacy, but we can influence its perceptions about potential gains from diplomacy to shape the incentives for it to come back. So a new policy construct of deterrence and risk reduction, I think, sounds a little bit simple in practice. There's obviously lots of complexity built into it and how you would implement it. But let me sort of briefly describe a few features of what I think it would mean. First, and here I want to disagree with Sue, I think we need to de-emphasize denuclearization. It's not just that it isn't practical, but it's dangerous, as I suggested before. I think the negative effects on other potential proliferants are overemphasized. Instead, we need to focus on security on the Korean Peninsula. It also means rethinking how best to meet our deterrence objectives. We have a lot of experience here. We've been deterring North Korea for 70 years, but we need to adjust how we approach deterrence as North Korea's capabilities have evolved. With allies, to me, that means focusing on comprehensive deterrence of North Korean aggression, which incorporates the breadth of US commitment to allied security, not just extended nuclear deterrence. As Sue stressed, the strongest symbol of US commitment to South Korea is the continued presence of 28,500 military personnel stationed there. That is not about nuclear deterrence. That is, I think, for me, the anchor of a more comprehensive approach to deterrence. Obviously, we need to adjust the alliance military and political activities with both South Korea and Japan. For me, we need to focus on cohesion. So a couple of the prior speakers talked about concerns over decoupling and how North Korea's strategy and development of tactical nuclear weapons can decouple the alliances. Again, this is largely a political concern, not a military concern. Let's focus on cohesion at the political level to allay those concerns. It also means, I think, identifying likely escalation pathways with North Korea and focusing our deterrence efforts there. Doesn't necessarily mean at this time changes in the capability that is deployed that contributes to deterrence, but it should result in changes about how we talk about capabilities and our objectives and maybe some posture choices as well. Not least, for me, it would be a really good idea to stop talking about targeting Kim Jong-un, for example, through the Korea Massive Punishment and Retaliation concept. I think if I can, one of the prior speakers from yesterday, Scott Sagan, had a great article from 2017 talking about the dangers inherent in emphasizing the threat to Kim Jong-un. And if we're going to pursue security, that means we need to offer him security as well. We also have to recognize that we can't deter everything, which means as allies, we need to prioritize and operationalize the threats that we're most concerned about. I think for many people, deterrence may seem like it's a sufficient answer, but I think we have to recognize that deterrence can fail, and it could fail in disastrous ways. And with the evolution of capabilities and nuclear posture in North Korea and the military posture in South Korea, conflict escalation could happen a lot faster in the future. The only way to address the risks of accident, misperception, or miscalculation is to try to manage deterrence through risk reduction, not threat reduction, which principally, I think, means as we think about it in the post-Soviet context, figuring out how to reduce arsenals and so forth. I mean more like kind of arms control as confidence-building measures, as ways to reduce the risks of conflict. So that means actions such as limitations on military exercises, cessation of missile testing, force exclusion zones around the DMZ, sort of a mix of steps that both North Korea and South Korea and the United States would take in the conventional and strategic areas. Ideally, we could go further towards the kinds of structural arms control steps that could stop arms racing and create even more predictability. I think that's a much longer term proposition, something that we should work toward, but that's going to take some time. As we do that, I think we have to be clear. This is not a solution to the problem of North Korea as a state with nuclear weapons. Rather, we are de-risking the long-term potential for war and reducing the impetus for South Korea or Japan to proliferate, creating more secure conditions that might ultimately enable Kim Jong-un to reduce his interest and reliance on nuclear weapons. So just by way of a very brief conclusion, can we thread this needle? Can we maintain strong deterrence while also finding restraints that would be acceptable to all the parties, that would not impact on strategic deterrence of China and Russia, and could be politically saleable? It's a pretty tough ask. I don't know that there's a lot of political courage in Washington or in Seoul or Tokyo to take on this ask right now. And yet, as others have stressed, the alternative is untenable. We're going to end up with deterrence, whether we like it or not. It's better to get ahead, in my view, with well-conceived policies rather than try to muddle through a potentially catastrophic crisis. Let me stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Toby Dalton. We will have about 25 minutes for discussion, and I would like to save at least 5 minutes for the final remark by the speakers. And I would like to give as much time as possible for the students as well. So before opening the floor, let me ask all the panelists, because I have lots of notes and questions. So Professor Huang, I wonder, Professor Huang Ji-hwan, I wonder if North Korea actually mentioned MED in its official rhetoric, and because lots of scholars who are working on this issue assess that because of the limited capacity of North Korea, perhaps North Korea's nuclear doctrine has been limited deterrence, not MED indeed. So that was my question. And Professor Hwang Il-do, I wonder how you assess the utility of North Korea's tactical nuclear weapons, because it is not likely that North Korea will use strategic nuclear weapons in a crisis, because it will be suicidal, right? So a lot of people pay attention to the utility of tactical nuclears in a crisis, because it can be used to threaten Iraq and the U.S. as in terms of nuclear shadow, to reach a political settlement as soon as possible. And Dr. Toby Dalton, I wonder if risk reduction through limiting exercises and others and keeping credibility of extended deterrence can be compatible. Do you think it's worth pursuing at the same time? So let me also open the floor to gather a couple of questions first. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Cecilia and I'm from Indonesia. I have 2 questions. My first question is directed to Professor Hwang Ji-hwan. I didn't quite understand about the part of your presentation in catalyzing China. Why Beijing would be happier if Pyongyang not pursuing a unilateral strategy of assured retaliations? And what will China gain by playing a role in deterrence against North Korea? And my second question is directed to Professor Hwang Il-do. Previously, Professor Victor Cha mentioned that agreement of negotiation between US and North Korea under the Obama administration only lasted 1 month. From your professional point of view, what went wrong and how does it affect the deterrence message that the US is trying to send? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the NEREC management, especially Professor Yim and his team, that he has provided such a great opportunity for us to interact one of the, the great scholars of the field, whom we have been read through, different means through internet, especially I have interacted with so many scholars, and this was a great opportunity to interact with the Korean scholars as well, to know their perspective. Having said that, my comment would be with Professor Il-do Wang's statement that countries with conventional inferiority sharing land border with potential foes evolved their doctrine into the direction of denial, deterrence, and first use. Professor Toby Dalton is, one of the great scholars who has contributed too much on this subject. Would agree or disagree to this fact that we in the international relations we usually derive so many constructs, so many concepts from the Cold War narratives. We apply those without thinking that whether they have any relevance in the ground realities or not. Especially we use so many concepts of the Cold War era into the the rivalry between India and Pakistan, since you had a reference to Pakistan. So I would say that in the Pakistan-India rivalry may be having so many differences that may not be compatible with that of the realities of North Korea and South Korea. Especially there is an ongoing, rivalry where across the border we have life rounds, life conflict is going on. There is a cross-border terrorism. India is supporting terrorism in the separatist movement in Balochistan, and Pakistan is favoring a freedom movement in Kashmir. And that is the cause of, greater discontent, whereas this fact is, in fact, you cannot find such a thing in North Korea and South Korea, where there is no, such things. So when it comes to tactical nuclear weapons and the deterrence, I think that I would have Toby Dalton's comment that deterrence probably suits the nations who have conventional inferiority, or who are facing the conventional superiority of their rivals. So in terms of Pakistan, we have seen that in the 2001 and 2, there was the Twin Peak crisis. Toby Dalton has contributed on these crises on various platforms. And then there was Bombay attacks. Then there was the Indian Parliament attack, where India, dumped its forces on the Pakistani border. And we have seen that Pakistani deterrence worked. So then there are the doctrinal modifications. If you the first use policy, India initially said in 1999, when they published the draft doctrine, they said that they would not go for the first nuclear use. But later on, when the official doctrine came, there was slight change. There was a limited provision of application of the nuclear first use. Then now we have seen that they are tempting towards modification of their nuclear doctrine. And why Pakistan developed tactical nuclear weapons? Again, I would seek the clarification from Toby Dalton. What exactly tactical nuclear? I am still confused, because in the previous section, one of the scholar also said that there is no clear definition of tactical nuclear weapons. As far as I am concerned, my knowledge is concerned, tactical nuclear weapons have two variables. One is that it has low yield, and second, it is pre-delegated. So in terms of Pakistan's tactical nuclear weapons, they are not pre-delegated. They are just low yield nuclear weapons, just developed to counter the Indian strategy. I forgot its name. Cold start nuclear doctrine. So that was to counter the cold start doctrine. What was cold start? That India is too big to mobilize its forces. So I would limit the question. So to counter Indian IBGs, Pakistan developed a short-range, low-yield nuclear missile. So probably. Then again, different difference in terms of there are so many differences between the situation Pakistan and India are facing and North Korea and South Korea are facing. So I would, say that application of such situations into a different context, it would give wrong results rather than, positive result. Your comment, please.
One more question from Professor Chung Bong-gun. Yes.
Hello, Toby. Good to see you. Just a very quick question to you. Our denuclearization diplomacy was more or less all or nothing approach. End up nothing. Now, I'm very glad that you raised this issue of nuclear risk reduction. But the problem of raising this issue is that people immediately may think that, oh, this is nuclear disarmament. So how my question to you is that I'm also think this nuclear reduction is definitely necessary at the moment because North Korea has about 50 nuclear weapons and they have a very aggressive nuclear doctrines. But is this nuclear risk reduction approach is what you could raise to your government, U.S. government? Is the U.S. government is ready to take some of these issues in addition to have this deterrence building approach?
We have 2 more students for questions.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful presentation, professors. And I have one question to Ji-hwan Hwang, professor. Yeah, actually you mentioned the MAD of North Korea, and I just feel like this and this is the illusion of North Korea. But I think this kind of illusions about MAD practically is helpful to DPRK to increase its national power, because building more nuclear weapons and other thing, and also United States do compellence policies sanctions against North Korea, but it doesn't I just don't feel it helps to decrease the arms race in Korean Peninsula and other thing. So I just want to know your suggestion about how to persuade North Korea to realize this kind of illusion you suggested. And the second question is to Toby Dalton, professor. And I'm just curious, you mentioned about confidence building measures, and what is the practical examples of these measures? Can you explain about that? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Soo Kyung Lee, and I'm currently studying international relations at Hanyang University. I want to thank all the professors for such great insight. I think all of the valuable discussions on the new strategies of the North Korean issue was something really valuable and something we had to really discuss. My 2 questions are directed towards Professor Ji-hwan Hwang. My first question was that I was particularly very interested in your idea of engaging the Chinese and their intervention on the North Korean nuclear expansion issue. But also you mentioned that Beijing doesn't necessarily hold great interest in terms of executing this plan. So how, if possible, could we be able to incentivize Chinese intervention? And what are the potential impacts of such action? What would it look like? And could it have any dangerous spillover effects to the region? Moreover, as a follow-up to that question, as we also discussed about the importance of the U.S. role and about U.S.-ROK alliance on such issue, I was wondering, as for future prospects in which we not only just see these efforts, but would it be also possible for us to see U.S. and China, despite their competitive relationship in the international regime, will be able to see close coordination in their action towards intervening and to better address the North Korean issue? Thank you so much.
Okay, for the responses to all those questions and your final remarks, you may have 5 minutes, starting from Professor Hwang Ji-hwan.
Okay, thanks a lot for all of your comment and your questions. I think I have many questions that I cannot answer, fully. So maybe I think that my presentation was quite provocative because it rouses so many questions. First of all, about the North Korea's nuclear postures, actually we are not sure about what kind of the nuclear posture Pyongyang has adopted. But so actually, what I said, I mean the assured retaliation, asymmetric escalation, and the catalytic strategies. As you understand, it's a categorization by the MIT professor, the VP Narang, and then I believe that it includes most of the North Korea's the choices that in their dealing with their own nuclear weapons. So actually, as the Professor Hwang Il-do said in his presentation, so it is kind of time of some kind of a transition period, from one to the other. But I still believe that the North Korea is now still, adopting the assured retaliation, and that it is not same to the concept of MAD, but actually it has many, similar, the things that because the assured retaliation need actually the secure second strike capabilities that can credibly threaten the nuclear retaliation. So the point is that whether the North Korea has the second strike capability at the moment, we may, think that the North Korea likely, have that undiscovered nuclear site and nuclear materials and nuclear in the arsenals. That I don't believe that it has, that sufficient, amount of the unknown, the nuclear capability. So now, of course, North Korea is trying to move forward, but still they are now, in a situation of, in a position of the assured retaliation and kind of, part of MAD. Second, about the catalyzing China. If there is the Chinese student here, Chinese people here in this room, I would like to ask them whether they are happier or not if the North Korea adopts the independent and unilateral the nuclear policy without consulting with China. So actually, as far as I understand, the North Korea is China's strategic asset and strategic liability simultaneously. That because North Korea has a nuclear capability, China may be happier because it will help China to balance against the United States on the Korean Peninsula. But China doesn't really want to the North Korea to possess nuclear weapons and conduct the unilateral, independent, the nuclear posture without consulting with China, because China really wants to, secure the status quo on the Korean Peninsula, because their focus is more about, the responding to the United States rather than responding to some accident on the Korean Peninsula. So it would be really Chinese people are really much happier if the North Korea can be disillusioned with that the myth of their nuclear deterrence and the MAD, and then they can consult with the Chinese people for the how to respond to the American intervention on the Korean Peninsula. Third, it's about the increasing capability, how to persuade North Korea to be disillusioned with this thing. It's a really difficult thing. It's really difficult, the country to persuade North Korea to, give up its nuclear weapons. That's why, the North Korea has, possessed the nuclear weapons program for the last 3 decades. But I don't mean that North Korea's nuclear weapons and North Korean nuclear deterrence is useless. I mean that their conventional posture is, quite sufficient to deter the United States from invading North Korea. So, as I mentioned at the first part of my presentation, their purpose is to deterrence, not offensive purpose, but for deterrence purpose. For their purpose is the deterrence that I think that still their conventional posture is sufficient, not quite sufficient maybe, but the nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons does not provide as much, deterrence capability as the conventional posture. So that's why I say that the nuclear deterrence is a kind of over deterrence and superfluous, redundancy. But still, it's really difficult, and I don't really know how to, persuade North Korea to be disillusioned with this thing. Maybe the U.S. and China need to play together to get North Korea to think again about the credibility of their nuclear weapons. So it's really important not to overemphasize the increasing threat of the North Korean nuclear power. Finally, regarding China, how to incentivize China to do that? So it's another, very difficult the policy, and then it's as I said that there is a closing windows of opportunity as the United States and China, move forward with their the strategic great power rivalry, and also the Russia, invaded the Ukraine. So even North Korea, even the Kim Jong-un once said that last year that he's perceiving that kind of the new Cold War rivalry, and the two separate blocks between the U.S. side and the other side, and the criticize that the U.S. Side. So there is a closing windows of opportunity, but still, I think that both the U.S. and China, and even the Russia, share some, the interest in, the deterring North Korea from, the moving forward with their nuclear capability, and also the moving toward more riskier and more dangerous, the nuclear posture, because although they compete with each other against each other, but both countries, wants some status quo on the Korean Peninsula rather than to see something happens on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
I also have so many questions, so I'd like to answer as much as possible. So first one is the utility of the tactical nuclear weapon. So actually, utility of nuclear weapon is making a stalemate, even when the two sides of the front line is their conventional capability is far more superior or inferior. Even in that case, nuclear weapon can make a stalemate, because even the conventionally superior side cannot attack or invade the inferior one because of the fear of their nuclear use. Tactical nuclear weapon can make the same situation, even in the context of North and South Korea as well. So if the North is, when the war is going on, and the front line is a little bit vulnerable or about to demolish or because of the conventional inferiority of the North Korean side, maybe they can use tactical nuclear weapon to block or to stop the South Korean or US ground forces advance. If they can avoid from the strategic or massive retaliation, nuclear retaliation from the United States, it would be far more favorable situation compared to the current conventional inferiority. So now we can think if North Korea's and United States response would be limited in the tactical or lowered nuclear level, even in that case, they can make a stalemate on the front line, and they can protect or save the regime's existence or the physical life of Kim Jong-un himself. That would be the military utility of tactical nuclear weapon, and it would be, how can I say, for my eyes, it sounds far more realistic or persuasive compared to the strategic nuclear weapons military utility toward the United States from the North Korea. Second one is Obama administration's message. I don't think that their message was wrong. I don't think the nuclear world without nuclear weapon was wrong. I believe it is quite a novel, idealistic kind of the direction that whole the international community should follow. But anyway, how this message was made in 2016 or before the North Korea's ICBM or tactical nuclear weapon kind of the advancement of their capabilities. So now we have different situation here. And once again, we have Ukrainian situation and Russia's tacit threatening of the nuclear use, even in the conventional warfare situation. So maybe we have to think about far more, how can I say, more adequate, more appropriate deterrence message for North Korea. So we have to think about more, how can I say, a combined nuclear deterrence message toward North Korea that I want to mention. So a final one is about Pakistani situation. Well, yes, it is quite understandable for the gentleman who questioned this question have some sort of uncomfortableness on my analysis. So actually, I also have some sort of the uneasiness when someone is talking about the North Korean issue or the Korean Peninsula issue without a very exact context, knowledge about the context or condition or something like that. But anyway, throughout all these cases, the making or extracting some sort of the concept or notion or theory is basically the job of academics. So, well, there should be so many differences. There should be so many contexts, I'm quite sure. But anyway, many analysts in this field, I mean the nuclear deterrence theorists, call Pakistan's deterrence model as an asymmetric escalation. And I'm quite sure that the North Korea is contemplating on following the same asymmetrical escalation model. So we can see the commonality or the similarity between two models. So that's what I mean. So I don't want to ignore all these differences you mentioned. Thank you. Yeah.
Toby.
Great. Well, I appreciate the questions, and let me try again in the spirit of simplicity and brevity to be direct. So Gina, on your question about the compatibility of risk reduction and the credibility of extended nuclear deterrence, I think there's actually a very natural relationship between these two concepts. If you reduce risks, then you reduce pressure on the credibility of extended deterrence commitments. There is a challenge, of course, which is that some of the steps that we could contemplate might affect readiness and military jointness. We have a lot of experience now with that over the last 3 or 4 years. I hope we can learn from that experience in thinking about how to address those challenges going forward. Let me pick up where Hwang Il-do left off on the question of the Pakistan model. I agree, as he did, that we have to be careful in drawing parallels between different regions and different experiences. I think India and Pakistan are kind of authoring their own deterrence relationship at this point that departs in some important ways from the Cold War experience. But I do want to be very careful in one area. The speaker asserted that Pakistani deterrence worked. Well, we need to be clear about what exactly it deterred and what it did not deter. Did Pakistan's nuclear weapons and its nuclear posture deter India from launching a massive conventional retaliation? Yes. Did it deter India in developing counter responses that it then attempted to exercise in subsequent crises? No. Does it deter India from trying to bleed Pakistan and vice versa through subconventional options? No. Does it enable Pakistan to repair its international reputation? No. So we need to be very careful in claiming that certain things worked or didn't work. We have to be very specific. Jun Bong-gun, on your question about denuclearization diplomacy and the sort of nuclear risk reduction approach, again, I want to be clear here. I'm not talking about just nuclear risk reduction. I think we need to look at risk reduction very broadly to include in the conventional area. I also, as I think about this, and it's a question that Gina and I have worked on some too, increasingly the deterrence environment on the Korean Peninsula is becoming very blurry between the nuclear and conventional areas. Partly that has to do with North Korean developments to include tactical nuclear weapons. Partly it has to do with South Korean capability developments too, to include with precision strike systems that are for strategic deterrence. So I think we need to think very broadly about what risk reduction looks like. Is there receptivities to these ideas in the US government? I think at this stage, it's a little bit early to say that there is. I don't see a lot of optimism for this administration. In part, I think they are trying to basically just keep a lid on anything on the Korean Peninsula so they can deal with other fires around the world, to include the burgeoning one in the Taiwan Straits that we're seeing right now. That said, there is increasing understanding and recognition that we are in a changing deterrence relationship with North Korea. And once that idea, I think, gains broader political acceptability, then risk reduction, I think, becomes a natural complement to that. Hopefully that will also become more politically acceptable too. And then lastly, on the question about the practical significance of CBMs, I think for me, we need to go back to kind of the origin of ideas about arms control, and in particular, Thomas Schelling and Morton Halperin, where they sort of viewed arms control largely about mitigating escalation risks and reducing the potential for arms racing and damage if there is a conflict. And in this case, I think CBMs can be helpful in avoiding crises, mostly to mitigate chances of accidents or misperceptions leading to crises or conflict escalation. That's, I think, where they can be helpful. Again, that's mostly at the conventional level, less at the nuclear level at this point. That said, if North Korea is intent on nuclear coercion, confidence-building measures aren't going to help that problem. That is, again, a deterrence problem, an alliance cohesion problem, and not a confidence-building measures problem. Again, thanks for the questions, the good discussion. Good to see everybody, and hope you have a tasty lunch.
Thank you. I think we had a great discussion, and thank all the panelists for their wonderful comments and students for their contributions to this panel. So the lunch is waiting, so I would like to say that this session is adjourned. Thank you.
I'd like to just make a quick announcement. During lunch, there will be poster presentations by the group's summer fellows at the NEREC program. So all the speakers are encouraged to visit the posters and give your wisdom, share wisdom with the students. Thank you.
KBS요? 네, 목요일마다.